at least our chapter, takes place during the time of the Judges, when things were not well in Israel for the most part. And the refrain of the book of Judges at the end is that every man did what was right in his own eyes. But God had plans for things to change, and those plans involved the life of a woman named Hannah. So 1 Samuel 1, verse 1. There was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Joram, the son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephrathite. He had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now this man used to go up year by year from his city to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the 2 priests of Eli, the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. And her rival used to provoke her grievously to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. So it went on year by year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. And Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? After they had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah rose. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly, and she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me, and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart, only her lips moved, and her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli took her to be a drunken woman. And Eli said to her, How long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away from you. But Hannah answered, No, my Lord. I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation. Then Eli answered, Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him. And she said, Let your servant find favor in your eyes. And the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. They rose early in the morning and worshipped before the Lord. Then they went back to their house at Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. And in due time Hannah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Samuel, for she said, I have asked for him from the Lord. The man Elkanah and all his house went up to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and to pay his vow. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, As soon as the child is weaned, I will bring him up, so that he may appear in the presence of the Lord and dwell there forever. Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Do what seems best to you. Wait until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord establish his word. So the woman remained and nursed her son until she weaned him. And when she had weaned him, she took him up with her, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and she brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. And the child was young. Then they slaughtered the bull, and they brought the child to Eli, and she said, O my Lord, as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who was standing here in your presence praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord. And he worshipped the Lord there. And Hannah prayed and said, My heart exalts in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. There is none holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth. But the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness, for not by might shall a man prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. Then Elkanah went home to Ramah, and the boy was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli the priest. And I'll read 2 additional brief sections, 18 to 21. Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy clothed with a linen ephod. And his mother used to make for him a little robe and take it to him each year when she went up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. Then Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife and say, "May the Lord give you children by this woman for the petition she asked of the Lord." So then they would return to their home. Indeed, the Lord visited Hannah. She conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters, and the boy Samuel grew in the presence of the Lord. And finally, verse 26, the boy Samuel continued to grow, both in stature and in favor with the Lord and also with men. When we pray to God with a petition, a request, it's because we have usually a problem or a need. There's something we're not able to accomplish or fulfill. There's a lack that we feel, and so we petition God. Well, in Hannah's case, the problem is very clear. Verse 2, and Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Back in those days, as we've seen in previous weeks, polygamy, marriage to more than one woman, was common. And in this case, Elkanah is not only married to Hannah, but to Peninnah. And Hannah wants children and has not been able to conceive. That's the problem. But the problem is made worse, actually, if we move on in the passage. First of all, it's made worse because of what it says in verse 5 and 6, the Lord had closed her womb. That's repeated twice. Hannah is a woman of faith. She's a woman who trusts in the Lord. And she knows that she's not having children because the Lord had closed her womb. So she's wrestling with her barrenness and she's wrestling with God. The problem is compounded again by the provocation of Peninnah. And Peninnah knows exactly what she's doing. Notice what it says in verse 6. Her rival used to provoke her grievously to irritate her. We have 3 strong words there. She provoked her grievously to irritate her. Why? Because the Lord had closed her womb. So it seems that Peninnah was not only mocking Hannah for her childlessness, but mocking her because her God, whom she served, had not given her children. There's further complications or further difficulties for Hannah, and that's the pattern of her problem. Because what does it say in verse 7? So it went on year by year, year by year. When we have a problem and it lasts a day, we can handle it. It lasts a couple of days, we can maybe still handle it. But when it lasts weeks and months and years, and we're calling out to God and He doesn't answer in the way that we want, that's a very difficult situation to be in, whatever it is, whatever our need is or problem is. There's one more complication to Hannah's problem, and that is that it complicates her worship. Peninnah would provoke her grievously every time they went up to the house of the Lord. They would go up to the house of the Lord to worship, probably at one of the annual feasts or maybe even at more than one of them. Shiloh was probably, 25 kilometers away from where they lived. And so her worship was complicated. She was supposed to praise the God who would not give her a child. And every time she went up to worship, her rival would provoke her. So Hannah couldn't worship. It says she couldn't eat. That was a meal of sacrifice. It was a meal of worship. She couldn't worship. Maybe you've experienced something like that, where somehow the worship services, for whatever reason, the loss of a loved one, whatever the case may be, the worship service is a difficult place to be. It's hard to come to the God with joyful people when you don't feel joyful yourself. So that's Hannah's problem. We move on to part 2, her prayer, verses 9 to 16. And there's just a few things we'll note about her prayer. First of all, the way she addresses God. She vows a vow and says, "O Lord of hosts." Now that's an interesting term. It's one that is used throughout the Old Testament. And Lord of hosts means Lord of armies, Lord of all the powers under heaven and in earth. The sovereign Lord, the almighty Lord, is in charge and in control. So Hannah is praying to the Lord, and she's confessing that the Lord is the one who is in control. The Lord who is in control of heaven's armies is also the one who is in control of her womb. And that's again what makes it so grievous for her, why she is so deeply distressed. And that's the second thing we should notice about her prayer, her emotion. We've already had Hannah weeping and sad, and now in verse 10 it says she's deeply distressed. She weeps bitterly. And later we're told she's praying in her heart. Her lips are moving. She's praying so fervently she looks like a drunken woman. And that's probably a testament to the character of the people around the tabernacle at that time. Eli thought she was a drunken woman. And Hannah answers and said, "No, my Lord, I'm a woman troubled in spirit. I've been pouring out my soul before the Lord. I've been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation." The words go on and on, how troubled and emotional she is. And this is an example for us, because we have many emotions too. And our emotions are given by God. And our emotions are also tainted by sin, because we live in a fallen world and we can't always trust them, but we're emotional people. And all throughout the scriptures, God teaches us to bring our heart to Him. We have a book of 150 Psalms, and so many of them are the author of the psalm bringing his heart to God. That's what Hannah does here. She can't worship. Her emotions are all in a mess. She can't eat. And she goes to the Lord of hosts and she pours out her emotions before Him. And then in the third place, we should notice about her prayer that she vows a vow, quite a vow, verse 11. "O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head." She's committing him to the vocation of a Nazirite, as described in Numbers 6. And Nazirite means a one who is set apart for the Lord. She's setting apart her son to the Lord for life. She's prepared to not only bear him, but then give him up. Quite a vow. Quite an incredible vow. As we'll see later, she had every intention of keeping it as well. We see in the third place the promise. Verses 17 to 20, if it can be taken that way. There's two interpretations. Eli answered, "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him." And she said, "Let your servant find favor in your eyes." Then the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. Now some would say that she's simply no longer sad because she has received acknowledgement that God heard her prayer. Through the priest, she knows that God heard her prayer, and so she's come to a place of peace after pouring out her soul to God. He's given her peace and joy again. I think it's likely that she took this answer from Eli as the promise of a child. Eli is shown throughout these narratives to be a very imperfect person, and his sons are very wicked men, but he was the priest of God. And she was in the temple or the tabernacle of God. And he said, "Go your way. May the God of Israel grant your petition. I think she took that from God as a promise. She went away and her face was no longer sad. And she ate. She couldn't eat before, now she can eat. And then she worships with her family the next morning. They go home, and in due time she conceives and bears a son. We see also Hannah's humility. She's let your servant find favor in your eyes. She has called herself a servant also in her prayer, and she provides the same kind of deference to the one who was the appointed, anointed priest of God. She's a humble woman, calling upon the Lord of hosts and receiving the word of his priest as a promise. And when the promise is fulfilled, she calls his name Samuel, related to the Hebrew word for asked. And often our names, not always, but often our names that we name our children have meanings as well. Hannah's name means grace. I don't know if that's why you named her Hannah, but may Hannah be full of grace. May she know the grace of God. We move on to part 4, the payment, verses 21 to 28. And this is titled The Payment because Hannah has made a vow, and a vow is of such a nature that you say to God, if you do this, God, then I will do this. So there's a payment to be made, the vow to be fulfilled, and Hannah makes the payment. She brings her son to the tabernacle and leaves him there to serve the Lord, a dedicated Nazaritic life to the Lord. This was a hard payment to make, hard vow to keep. She finally received a son after all these years. She had one son. Not only that, the text stressed that he was weaned. He was still very young and tender, but of course old enough to have developed a very strong love and connection. Verse 24 goes out of its way to say he was a young boy, and the child was young. She brings this young boy to Shiloh and drops him off at a tabernacle. That's not necessarily a good place to be. The priests of the sons of Eli were corrupt, lying, cheating, womanizers. But yet she had vowed the vow, and she would fulfill it. But there's something even more striking. Not only does she fulfill her vow, but she considers it a great privilege to do so. Notice that she accompanies it with a sacrifice, a 3-year-old bull. There's no requirement in the law for them to sacrifice a bull. That was a very significant, expensive offering. It's like you're required to offer a piece of farm equipment like a lawnmower, and instead you deliver up a tractor. Like she gave more than she needed to give. And she's reflecting something of what we see elsewhere in the Old Testament. And this is from the lips of David. The people of Israel give willingly for the building of the temple. And then David prays this amazing prayer. It's 1 Chronicles 29, 10-16. David said, "Blessed are you, O Lord, the God of Israel, our Father, forever and ever. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty. For all that is in the heavens and in the earth is yours. Yours is the kingdom, O Lord, and you are exalted as head above all. Both riches and honor come from you, and you rule over all. In your hand are power and might, and in your hand it is to make great and to give strength to all. And now we thank you, our God, and praise your glorious name. But who am I? And what is my people that we should be able thus to offer willingly? For all things come from you, and of your own we have given to you. For we are strangers before you and sojourners, as all our fathers were. Our days on the earth are like a shadow, and there is no abiding. O Lord our God, all this abundance that we have provided for building you a house for your holy name comes from your hand and is all your own." What an awesome prayer. And Hannah's demonstrating something of the same spirit when she comes with a sacrifice bigger than is needed and required by the law. And this is a reminder for all of us that all we have, every skill, every possession, every strength, our health, everything is a gift to be used as we live our lives, in the words of Romans 12, as living sacrifices in response to God's salvation. God has given us his only Son. God has made us his adopted children. As we saw this morning, he's given us the right to become children of God. This gift is so inexpressible, and we have the privilege of offering everything in return in service to God. Move on in the 5th place to the praise of Hannah, and it's 10 verses. We'll just note a couple of things. She sings a song to the Lord. First thing we should note about this song is that it's reminiscent of the Exodus song the Israelites sang when they crossed the Red Sea. God delivered them in a miraculous way, a way that no human being could bring about, and they sang a song of praise to God. And Hannah's song reaches explicitly back to that song. And we should also note that Hannah's song becomes an exemplar template for the song of Mary when she conceives Jesus. So what we have Hannah doing here is expressing her joy, expressing her victory, expressing her faith in light of God's salvation from beginning to end. What is happening to her is just a little picture of what God is doing in the world, bringing fruitfulness to a barren world through the birth of a son. So we see in Hannah's song a great contrast between the humble and the proud. Who will God ultimately save? Who will God ultimately give joy to and fruitfulness to? To the humble, to those who are humble before him. So in verses 4 to 7, I'll read them again. Just note the contrast. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. And then again in verse 9, God will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness. For not by might shall a man prevail. And we saw that extensively in the first service as well. Not by might shall a man prevail. Faith is first of all a faith of fainting and not of fighting. It's first of all learning to live in dependence upon God and humility before him, waiting upon his timing, throwing ourselves upon him. We also see one more thing in the psalm, the song of Hannah, and that's verse 10. In verse 10, Hannah becomes a prophet. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. He will give strength to his king. But Hannah lived in the days of the judges. She didn't live in the days of the kings. There were no kings in Israel. In fact, her son would become the first kingmaker who would anoint both Saul and David, the first 2 kings of Israel. So what is Hannah doing here? Well, she's functioning as a prophet. God's going to bring about a king. And that king is not ultimately David. The king is ultimately Christ. Christ who will judge the ends of the earth. Christ who will be victorious over all. Christ who says, come and bow the knee to me, your Savior and your Lord. There's one more thing to note, and that is the purpose of the birth of Samuel. And this will hopefully help us to understand in our own wrestlings with prayer. God answered Hannah's prayer miraculously, and it's a beautiful story. But God doesn't always answer prayers in the same way, whether it's for a child or for something else that we feel that we so desperately need and want. He doesn't always say yes. But God will always answer in a way that is in the first place good for us, as we saw this morning, and in the second place in a way that furthers his kingdom purposes. Whether we would like a child or a spouse or a job or a car or health or whatever we ask for, God will grant us these things in accordance with his kingdom purposes. And if he doesn't grant them, it is for our good and his glory. So, what am I trying to say here? Well, as we read through the little snippets in chapter 2, we skipped over some sections, and those sections describe the wickedness of the priesthood at the time. The wickedness especially of Eli's sons. And we're reminded that this was at the time of the judges, when everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. Israel was going downhill, and going downhill fast. And there was just wickedness present everywhere. And through God's answering Hannah's prayer, he brings about Samuel, who would be this devoted man to the Lord and would become in Israel a judge and a priest and a leader, and through whose ministry God would work to unite the nation and then eventually bring about the kingship. God had purposes with Hannah. God loved Hannah. He heard the cry of Hannah's heart. He answered her prayer. But God also had purposes that were much broader than Hannah, for the unification of his people and for the eventual coming of the Savior, the Messiah. We have to see all our own desires and sorrows and prayers in this light as well. Isn't this what Jesus teaches us in the Lord's Prayer? Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done. God teaches us to submit everything in our life to his ultimate purposes for us and for the world. May Hannah be a child who grows up and lives in this light, and may John and Kara receive much strength to raise her in the grace of God, for the grace of God. Amen.